All right, welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today's is a interview I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson on with me today because Dr. Jeanson has been studying Native American history, which is something I've been fascinated with since I was a little kid growing up in the Chicago area. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, through the study of genetics and many other disciplines, has discovered shocking things about Native American history that really kind of turns the sort of the traditional narratives upside down. And so I'm thankful to have Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson on today. And Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has a bachelor's degree in molecular biology and bioinformatics from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, sort of my old stomping grounds. I'm from Illinois. He has a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. He has authored several books, including Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species, Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise, and They Had Names, Tracing the History of North American Indigenous People, which is the one we're going to focus on today. He is currently a researcher for Answers in Genesis, which is known for its popular Ark encounter and its controversial young Earth creation stance on the origins debate. So Nathaniel, I asked you to come on because I believe your research is really cutting edge, and it's essential to the question of who are our Native American neighbors? Who are they? Where do they come from? Because your history has a lot to do with who you are, and it's really wrapped up in a lot of mystery. I've always been fascinated, growing up in Illinois as a kid. Even the name Illinois is an indigenous name. My high school football team was the Redskins, and my middle school I went to was Shabana, which was a local chief from that area. And I lived sort of near the area of Cahokia, which I never got to visit, unfortunately. But of course, the area of Cahokia in Illinois is prominent in your latest book. So I was always taught that Native Americans came here like 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait, and they kind of lived a harmonious life with nature. They don't deny that there was conflicts and stuff, but largely harmonious with nature for 15,000 years, and then the Europeans arrived and things changed. And I think it was like 5 years ago, I picked up that book, 1491 by Charles Mann, and that really stirred the pot for me, that book. It's a shocking reality that there was these advanced civilizations here for a very long time with rich religions and philosophy and even sciences. They built cities that rivaled European cities in technology and size. But they also had wars and conflicts, much like the rest of the world. It's an unbelievable history that was here, and we know so little about it. And so, I've looked into it, the history is what can we know? And all we get is like frustratingly little information, just some mythologies and legends, which are interesting and they do say things about them, but they don't seem to unlock enough to satisfy my curiosity where they came from and what their history is. And so that's when I stumbled across Nathaniel Jeanson's work. You've been studying their genes and what their genes can tell us about their history. And that's why I wanted to bring you on. And my goal today is to spark interest of Alaskans into your research, because you are looking for help for your research to advance and move forward. You've been pleading and asking in all of your videos for help. And so I would like to help you with that because I believe in your research and I find it essential. So the neatest thing I've been finding about your research is that you are a geneticist. From your PhD is in basically studying genetics, but you've brought in these other disciplines. So they got genetics, and there's archeology and linguistics and a lot of historical data and histories from the Native people themselves. And what you've been finding is a lot of agreement between these disciplines. And that for me has been most interesting, that it's not just the genetics, it's not just the archaeology, it's all of these disciplines combined together and you're able to put together a narrative of the Native American history. So I want to discuss that with you today, and I hope that it sparks interest by Alaskans to help you. And we'll put that plug in the show notes and at the end of this episode how people can help. So Nathaniel, thank you so much for taking some time and coming on my little podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you and with your audience.
Yeah, you bet. So let's start at a 30,000 foot view. Could you give us an overall view of your research project right now, specifically with Native American history?
I'll take it up to 60,000 foot view, just because given the state of many Bible colleges today, I want to address some of the bad rap, I guess, that young earth creation gets, just from what I've been able to pick up on in my interactions. Namely, there's this stereotype of young earth creation is almost embarrassing. Yes, they have this strong biblical stance, is what I hear about young earth creation. But on the science side, it's weak, and that's where it especially gets embarrassing, because I seem to disagree with so much evolution or mainstream science. And oftentimes the way the question is phrased to people like me is, how do you reconcile the Bible and science? And I'm saying 60,000 foot view because we're now at a new era, dramatically new era, and I think I can say this objectively. I mean, each person has to evaluate for themselves. We're no longer in that defensive posture of, well, here's how I try to make some adjustments to assumptions in mainstream science, or find some holes in evolution and still find comfort at night reading Genesis plainly. In my field in particular, we're now going on offense. So it's no longer that the Bible is, we can find creative ways to harmonize the Bible and science, but the Bible is becoming a necessary prerequisite, and particularly the young earth view, and in particular in the question of pre-Columbian North American history, or pre-Columbian American history, I should say. So I want to emphasize that. And again, that's a claim, a promise that I intend to support, and I've tried to support my documentation. But the big picture view is we're now in a new era, and this whole arena of pre-Columbian North America is solving questions that evolutionists have been unable to solve for decades. I grew up knowing nothing. So Wisconsin has indigenous history. There's indigenous tribes, reservations, and such. Potawatomi Casino was just up in Milwaukee. You've got Oneida, I think, up near Green Bay. We went to, I think, a Menominee reservation, perhaps, as one of our mission trips. So there were interactions. Again, the Native American population is not large in Wisconsin, but there's opportunities. But I still grew up knowing nothing, and didn't come into this with this long-standing, lifelong goal of figuring it out. It just was this constant source of ignorance that lingered in the background. I began as a professional creation scientist about 15 years ago, and started off on the question of the origin of species, humans being one of many. And so my focus was much broader originally, but you go eventually where the data are, and the National Institutes of Health has a $45 billion annual budget, or did, I think, in 2021, probably has increased since then, which funds primarily human research. So of all the species alive on Earth, aside from maybe a few bacteria, humans are the best studied at the genetic level. So about 10 years ago, my focus began to shift more towards the human question, just because there's massive amounts of data there. And then you go where you make discoveries, or to kind of flip things around, to apply what I learned in graduate school, which was take what you know and beat it to death until it yields all of its secrets. I was trying about 6, 7, 8 years ago to figure out the history of the globe, ultimately, of course, because that's what ties into young earth claims about literal Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago, Noah about 4,500 years ago, restarting with 8 people, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, looking for Babel, Genesis 11, all that. That was my focus, and trying to make sense in particular. So the specific type of DNA I was looking at was the male inherited Y chromosome, for technical reasons we could get into. But that was my tool. Didn't know where. So just to lay out the process, I was looking at DNA from people around the globe, comparing them. This was published data, and from those DNA comparisons, you can reconstruct mathematically those comparisons, and it just happens to look like a family tree. This is pretty basic genetics and mainstream science so far. But the question, of course, then is, where is the beginning of the tree, this family tree based on DNA, and how is time measured along the branches. And of course, Scripture, even a young earth reading, doesn't give you explicit statements on how and male inherited DNA is supposed to show this. It does give you some male genealogies, for example, Genesis 10, the sons of Noah and their sons and so forth. But there's a lot of hypotheses to test, and one of the key tools at that point was taking, you had mentioned the book 1491 from Charles Mann, and he of course talks about the massive population collapse in the Americas after the arrival of Europeans. Looking for that, and I should add there's actually two parts to it. So there's the collapse, and in some tribes, in some nations, I'll use the Navajo as an example, there's been a recovery. So in the late 1800s, the Navajo's own website says the population was around 10,000, may have been a few thousand more from people who were in outlying areas, but not large is the point. And in the 2010 U.S. Census, that number has now increased to 400,000. Depending on how you measure, is it strictly pure-blooded, is it not? But it's a significant recovery from where the population numbers used to be in just about a century. Evolution, basically, because of the tools they have and the constraints they have and how they interpret the data, will likely never be able to detect that. They have claims about the population collapse, but the collapse and recovery they can't. It's only with a young earth view that you can see this real history in fine temporal detail. And I don't mean that as a trying to read my assumptions in, but this is objective history of what happened with real numbers, and you can see that mathematical precision played out in the genetic data with the young earth time frame. And that was a key step then to be able to narrow down where's Noah. So this helped me figure out, okay, finding that population collapse and recovery, here's how time is measured on the tree, here's some clues then, some constraints to figure out where the beginning of the tree is, and that led us down a path which several years later allowed us to find Noah. And just as a side note, we now have the ability to trace any people group's history back to specific sons of Noah with his DNA, back to specific men in Genesis 10, because the mirror image of that genealogy of men in Genesis 10, you can now find at the base of this male inherited DNA-based family tree. And so this was a hugely exciting step, and it was really after that. So that book, Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise, came out 2022, Finding Noah. We did a series of videos following on from that, and that's what began. We asked, so I did videos including on Native American history. Still only had a few clues at that point as to what was going on from genetics and a few indigenous accounts. Started asking for input from other groups and learned the hard way. By that point, I had already learned some of the hard way. You can't just go into Native American groups, Native Alaskan groups, and say, hey, come talk to me. You have to be invited. And that was made clear to me by some of the people who did contact me. One Ojibwe lady had said, this is the way to do it. We contact you. You don't contact us. Otherwise, we're not going to speak to you. I said, well, this would explain my experience. Thank you. And that's how I've been proceeding ever since then, rather passively. I did make a Native Alaskan contact as part of that too, who had reached out to me. So fast forward now to the book that just came out this year in 2023. Realized I should probably take the research for one of the regions to completion or towards another publishable book, just to think through what's my constraints as an employee of Answers in Genesis. Can't just go on having fun in the ivory tower forever. At some point, produce something that's beneficial to people, and it's a nice motive to have, but at some point you have to actually get results. And in God's kind providence, we did. And so to make a long story short, the continued digging into genetics and then looking into published histories. So some of these published histories come from U.S. government sources, ethnologists who were sent out to tribes in the late 1800s, early 1900s, wrote down what the elders said and so forth. Anyway, we found a lot of confirmation between genetics and indigenous histories. Maybe the premier example of this would be as we continue doing videos then on North American pre-European history and asking people, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, if they're interested in participating, to contact me. I was contacted by the executive director of the Lakota Treaty Council Conference, Phil Two Eagle. And Lakota, of course, are very strongly traditional, anti-Christian to a degree. So we normally have nothing to do with each other otherwise, because they maintain a very strong anti-colonial stance. They disparage the Navajo because they're westernized. They got a westernized form of government. We still have the 7 council fires, very egalitarian structure. So all that's still very much there. Was invited to speak at their December 2023 conference, the Treaty Council Conference. One of the few Caucasians there over 3 days, and again heard lots of anti-colonial, almost anti-Christian talk from the front, to the extent that I thought, why do they invite me? what am I doing here as an open creationist, open Christian? And why do they want me to come? They asked me to come speak on DNA and indigenous histories. And what I came to in terms of an answer to my own question was that the Lakota, like many Native American tribes, are not evolutionists, for one. Very traditional, but traditional view has a creationist element to it, not necessarily the Christian God, but there's great spirit creator. There's that idea, and they thoroughly oppose this idea of crossing the Bering Strait, which of course evolution teaches 15,000 years ago. Lakota religion, as a matter of doctrine, is we've always been here on this continent and originated here, which of course creates conflict with mainstream science, which is a whole other discussion. My impression from talking with the executive director was because they, like many other tribes, have maintained a fairly closed society, don't leave the reservation, they're now sort of beginning to engage the outside world, which includes genetics, and they have to make sense of that. I could even see the wheels in his head kind of turning as we had Zoom conversations leading up to the conference, and realizing, okay, well, if we say we originated here, well, how do we explain the Africans? And you can see him trying to then process the outside world in the context of his own indigenous worldview. But why me? Ultimately, I think the answer is because the evolutionary community, the mainstream community, tends to be condescending and disparaging of indigenous histories. There is a postmodern, I'll call it that just because it's contradictory. There is all the evolutionists, all the mainstream scientists hold to this idea of a crossing of a Bering Strait that is not compatible with the indigenous worldview. They tend to reject any of their indigenous accounts because they tend to be oral until written down late in history. Like I said, late 1800s, 1900s, maybe 1700s if you're an East Coast tribe, let's say. And of course, naturally, they don't abide that condescension. And so I've come along, done these videos and say, hey, look, this young earth creationist view actually is validating what y'all say about your history. And the Lakota and their linguistic relatives, members of the Sioux and Catawban language family, have a very detailed account of coming, Lakota, let's say, from Minnesota, and then others saying actually ultimately we came from the East Coast near Washington, D.C. in the late A.D. 800s, 800, and before that we came from the north, and that's kind of where the records go cold. They have some astronomical data perhaps tying them back to the Black Hills area and the BC era, but that view tends to be dismissed, ignored, marginalized by mainstream science, and brought me in, even though, again, normally would have nothing to do with each other given our different worldviews. Here's something, a way perhaps to regain dignity and value, and that's been one of the exciting discoveries for me, is to see, of all things, here's the biblical worldview, young earth science, returning dignity and value to indigenous people. And so the book I wrote, They Had Names, relies very heavily on indigenous accounts to reconstruct exactly what went down. And the purpose for the book are multifold. Part of it's personal, again, because I grew up knowing nothing, and so it's been exciting to learn, here's what actually happened. Here's where the kings, here's the rulers. In some cases, we actually have the names because of indigenous accounts of the most famous rulers and so forth. There's of course, an academic element to it as well, an apologetic element of here we're now taking the lead in solving questions, and I feel like the videos we've done, some of which have gone viral, are an example of that. We're realizing the fruits of it. It's not a brag of me or anything as much as the scriptural worldview is true. It's making sense of the world, and it answers questions evolution has been unable to. And I've had people contact me saying, I don't like that Bible stuff, but I think you're onto something. And so it's forcing people to sit up and listen to something they would normally not want to listen to or not even think about listening to. But when you take the lead in science and are able to do bona fide detective work and solve questions that other frameworks cannot, this is, I think, what results and is a very encouraging sign for the future.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. I want to listen to that like 3 more times because so much to unpack. One of the takeaways I'm taking from your research is, first of all, is the predictive power, going from defensive, which has historically been creation science or defending the biblical narrative has been a defensive position. And what you're saying now, that is shifting to offensive. So one of the hallmarks of good science is the predictive power of a theory. And so you're saying creation science is now turning the tables to where they are making predictions that are coming true. And one that I remember is like Dr. Jason Lyle's prediction about the James Webb Telescope and what they would discover. And what he predicted is exactly what they saw in that telescope. And now with you, you have predictive power by applying the genetic data through the biblical narrative, and you're able to make predictions in what you're going to find. And you've already been finding them to come true, and you're seeing cohesion between not just known history, like, for example, the certain tribes that grew in population that shows up, or bottlenecks in the population that shows up in your research, but it only shows up when you interpret the data from a biblical perspective. And so in that sense, it's offensive science rather than defensive. And then the interactions with the Lakota was so fascinating, and because they do have these oral histories. Many of them we've written down since, and what you're discovering in the genetic data is that it is consistent with their own oral histories. And there's almost, from what you're saying, there's like resentment from some of the Native community that the evolutionary worldview and that history is not consistent with their oral histories. But the biblical data is consistent with their own oral histories. And so that's why there's a spark of interest and fascination. It's like, this is what you're saying about your own history is probably true. And that is sparking response from the Native community. So that's amazing stuff, Nathaniel. And I like that there's a connection now between the origins, if you will, or the story of the Native people and the biblical narrative, specifically like the Table of Nations from Genesis all the way up till now. So that's why this stuff fascinates me so much, is these real life objective connections is really amazing. So I want to ask you, can you tell us more about, you mentioned Y chromosome, which is only in the male DNA. Explain to us, for us simpletons, us laymen, how is it that you can withdraw history from the Y chromosome in males?
The basic process is each generation, and this is something we've been able to measure, there's mistakes that happen. So the Y chromosome, if you think of DNA kind of like an alphabet with 4 letters, and you line up the letters and they can make words and genes and that sort of thing. Of course, it reads like a foreign language because it is, but it is a language that contains tremendous amounts of information compressed to an incredible degree. Computer scientists are looking at DNA for inspiration for how to compress and transmit information and store it and so forth, which of course bespeaks its grand design by a superintelligence, which we know of course is God himself, as revealed in Scripture. The Y chromosome is about 60 million letters long. So the human DNA as a whole is more than 3 billion. It's gigantic. In each person, each cell, there's 6 billion because you have 2 copies of it. Were diploid would be the technical term, but we have DNA. The Y chromosome is about 1% of the total, but that's only in males. Females are XX, males are XY. It's about 60 million letters long, and this is sobering for me to even remember this and to think about. The technology we have to get the DNA sequence is still being developed. So of the Y chromosome sequence, about 10 to 20 million is stuff we can reliably read. So most of it is the type of sequence that it's still tough to crack with technology. Wow. So here we are in 2025, and we're still staring our own DNA in the face and saying, how do we figure this out? But of the DNA that we can analyze reliably and repeatedly, so I said it changes every generation. One way to discover that, and one way it's been measured, is you just take dads and sons. Find a set of dads, find their boys, get dad's DNA compared to son's DNA, count the number of differences. And of the 10 to 20 million letters, on average, about 3 mistakes happen. So it is almost literally needles in a haystack. It's just such a tiny fraction. And what's interesting is if you compare DNA from men around the globe, we're all about 99.9% identical. So we're all very close genetically. It's not hard to find differences. Are those differences the result of mistakes? and there really isn't anything about a mistake in most cases that tells us it's a mistake. So if I compare my DNA to your DNA, we'll see differences, but it's not like I can just take your DNA and without comparing it to anyone else's and say, oh, that's a mistake, that's not. In some cases, if it is in a part of a gene, which is kind of like a word that performs some function, and it interferes with the biological function, okay, that's a mutation, that's a mistake. But the point I'm getting at is, by and large, the steps to analyze DNA and extract information from it would be, you get DNA sequences, you compare them. It's easy to find differences because almost all the DNA is identical. So you just line up a DNA like a string of letters and match, just tons of matches, and then the rare mismatch. And you can then just mathematically, so we just plug that into a computer program, align these DNA sequences, because there's programs to do it, and it's fairly straightforward because, again, there's so many matches that exist among everyone. Line them up, count the number of differences, and then you can create this gigantic spreadsheet where you compare every man to every other man in terms of his differences. Or what we do is we just plug all this data into a computer and say, spit out a visual display of the data, and it just so happens to look like a family tree with branches. And you can then ask the question, okay, we know DNA changes every generation right now. We know there's differences among people groups. That's what's interesting too, is just that's an empirical observation. Oh, look, sub-Saharan Africans have this level of similarity to one another, but this level of difference from Europeans, let's say. There's clusters that form in terms of DNA similarities and differences. And we can ask the question, can we go back in time? Is this a bona fide record of family history? That was one question I had about, so this is a paper I published 2019, so 6 years ago or so. Yes, there's published data on father-son mutation rates, about 3 mistakes per generation, but given the total worldwide differences, has that rate been consistent? Are there new mistakes that occur every generation? Has that happened historically? And one way to test that would be, you can look at the branches, and this is, so to make a long technical story short, you can look at branches in a family tree and they record changes in population size. And so we can go to archeology, we can go to historical records from like the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty in China, and say, here's what these fields of science say is the history of human population size. Does it match what we see in genetics, or do we have to change how we interpret genetics to get these two pieces of information to line up? And the short answer is, a very straightforward interpretation of the family tree works. It looks like we've got lots of data suggesting it's been just this fairly constant rate of mistakes every generation. And so this DNA, if you compare it one to another, is a record of a generation by generation history of humanity. It's a family tree, and from that family tree we can see, oh, here's a cluster of Chinese, here's a cluster of Native Americans. Oh, they meet at this point in history, and that sort of thing. So the DNA differences are a surrogate marker of the passage of time, and it basically comes down to a math question. And from the math in the tree, you can start attributing dates to when people groups separated, when people groups joined, when they rose and fell, and so forth.
Yeah, fascinating. And I remember watching one of your previous videos about the population thing, how confirming it was that these mutation rates have been basically consistent over time, because I know you've made a reference, and I've actually read some of the technical data from, for lack of a better term, secular scientists that they noticed this, and so they started messing with the data to get a longer history of humanity, because they didn't get the conclusion they're looking for, so they started adding filters, basically, which was astonishing to me that they would do that, that you didn't get the conclusion you wanted, so you start tweaking it. But from what you're saying is that if your hypothesis is true, the population data ought to match the population data from archaeology and other sources, and you found an incredible match that's based on your interpretation of the data, and you found consistency. So that's another kind of offensiveness to your hypothesis, to interpreting the data through a biblical worldview. So tell us, let's zoom this into Native Americans. Tell us how the Y chromosome data points to a timing or a date of migration or migrations into the Americas.
And let's bring in Native American histories here too, because I'm going to tell the story of the Red Record, because that's what's transformed my own view of Native American histories, where now, essentially, if I come across a new document or if I hear a new account of Native American migration, my default assumption is to assume it's true. And the reason being, one of the most infamous documents that still is rejected by mainstream science, and they got the Delaware of Oklahoma to reject it as well. The point I'm going to get at is, if we've gotten previous documents so wrong, if our traditional methodologies for choosing or sorting among indigenous histories has turned out to be such a failure, then we should definitely question the methodologies we're using. And anyway, that's what's flipped my view. And there's caveats to it. I know there's some histories are not reliable, and I say that based on a conversation I had with a Native American. I think she may have been Navajo, or one of my contacts had said, yes, this particular researcher, you can't trust him because he was giving candy to children, and of course children will tell you anything you want to hear for candy. Fine, don't have to trust what he said. But this guy over here, he sat down with the elders and recorded accurately what they said, and so he's a good source. That's what I mean by defaulting to true unless there's good evidence otherwise. So the Y chromosome, inherited from father to son, record then of paternal history, really interesting theoretical concept then of and expectations you might take to the data ahead of time, like, okay, is this record of warriors? What is it? And we can come back to that point. But for Native Americans, the Y chromosome contains two main branches. So actually, let me back up and give the even wider context. Of course, today, among Native Americans, like so many other groups, there's a whole mix of branches because of the effects of European colonialism and even the effects of the transatlantic slave trade. You can find among Native Americans in North America or Latin Americans in Central and South America, European-based branches or European-derived branches, Africa-derived branches, especially, let's say, in Brazil or even in Colombia, let's say, you can find African-derived branches. Puerto Rico, plenty of African-derived branches, the Caribbean, such, just how the slave trade played out. So once you remove the obvious effects, and it is obvious based on where the branches come out and such, you can see all that real history. You can see the history of colonialism. You can see the history of the transatlantic slave trade with great precision with the young Earth time scale, lots of confirmation of known history. And you're left with just the indigenous branches. The Y chromosome shows two major migrations. One of them, and this is the dominant branch of the Americas, and dominant, just to give another example, the Navajo belong to this branch, upwards of 90% of the men. Very dominant branch. This branch, which if you look at the technical terms, haplogroup is the technical term for branch. They just assign letters of the alphabet, so this is branch or haplogroup Q in the Y chromosome tree. 90% of the Navajos and a very strong presence up and down the Americas. This came into the Americas around the AD 300s to 600s, or just if we want to have a nice round number, around the 4 to 500s after Christ. And this is a really interesting data point because this is a period in history. So just to add some geography to this shows a migration from Asia into the Americas, from Central Asia in particular into the Americas around that time period. That is a time period, and mainstream science, mainstream history recognizes this as such, called it's a German word, the Völkerwanderung, or the Great Wandering of Peoples. This is the same time when other Central Asians, namely the Huns, migrated into Europe, accelerated the destruction of the Roman Empire, and we can see genetically, to this day, the genetic echo of that event, and this Q branch is actually a relative of that. So this migration is, I can say confidently, relatives of the Huns who come to the Americas. And in East Asia, so Roman Empire falls. Roman Empire is kind of the classic civilization.
Nathaniel, are you suggesting that like Native Americans are related to Attila the Hun?
At least to his people. I don't know that we have the exact branch of Attila, but we have branches coming from Central Asia at that exact point. They're at low levels in Europe, but very strong genetic echo, even though it's at low levels, but clear in terms of the timing and the geography. This seems to be the branch of the Huns. Whether it's Attila or not is an open question, but that same branch or relatives of that same branch break away around the same time, come to the Americas. And it's this same period where you have another Central Asian group, the Shanbai, coming into China. So Han Dynasty is sort of the Roman equivalent in China, falls around the same time. It straddles the time of Christ in terms of its reign, falls after the time of Christ, and Shanbai come in. Anyway, so I don't think it's any surprise then. It sort of makes emotional and historical sense that we have migration, because we already know from history. Central Asians going to Europe, Central Asians west into Europe, Central Asians east into China. Why not Central Asians even further east into the Americas? The other migration that the Y chromosome shows right now is in the AD 900s, so several centuries later, again from sort of the Central Asian, Siberian, Northeast Asian region. But this we can now line up confidently using census numbers and statistics for the frequency of this branch. We can line up this migration and Y chromosome branch, it's haplogroup C, ABC, with the Algic people groups, the Algonquians, which includes Blackfeet, Cree, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Illinois, you mentioned earlier, your home state, or where you grew up in Delaware. So the Delaware have an account, the Red Record or Wallam Olam, came to European attention or European American attention in the early 1800s, a Kentuckian named Rafinesque, and was the subject of curiosity and study. Even I think Eli Lilly or others wrote about this in the 1950s, and was viewed as perhaps legitimate for most of its history, until 1995, when a PhD student, Ostreicher was his name, wrote his thesis saying it was a fraud, that Rafinesque was a fraud. There we go. He was a fraud. Invented this document out of whole cloth, and was not a real history at all. And so Ostreicher, the 1995 graduate student, through his influence, got the Oklahoma Band of Delawares to repudiate the document as authentic and reject it as a real history. Fast forward, 20, 25 years, I'm doing research on the Y chromosome, excuse me, and find this migration from the 900s AD. Well, it turns out in the Red Record, this Wallam Olam Delaware document, or supposedly Delaware document, there are timestamps. The majority of the document describes a step-by-step or sachem by sachem, chieftain by chieftain, basically migration. Tickle my throat, sorry. From Asia into the Americas. Late in the document, there's these timestamps that allow you to sort of extrapolate back in time and estimate when this migration occurred, and it agrees with genetics. And so my response to Ostreicher and his claims against the authenticity of the document is, how does a fraud make claims that anticipate genetic discoveries 200 years in the future? Doesn't make sense. Must be an authentic document, and we have, based on this harmony with genetics and the Red Record, been able to confirm and find echoes in archaeology, find echoes across other indigenous histories, find echoes in linguistics. There's multiple independent lines of evidence that all attest to the authenticity of the Red Record. And it was that experience where we go from a very public repudiation and rejection of the document to, wait a minute, we got this all wrong. This is a real history that they kept careful track of, that lines up with rigorous fields of science. What else are we getting wrong? And that's what's led to my default to whatever I hear, I assume it's probably true, unless we've got good evidence otherwise. And being able to gather these documents and histories, again, oral histories that at some point got written down, and compare them with linguistics, has been a richly fulfilling study, and opened up a whole new window into the past that ultimately then led to this book and further research. So in terms of the Y chromosome, 2 major migrations. In the book they had names. I talk about there being a great mystery of what happened before the AD 400s or so, 300s, when this most ancient branch came over. And anyway, that led to some new discoveries that just came out in July, but this is just an example of research that's ongoing. And I'll add one more point here too. The research I'm currently working on for Mesoamerica, Central America, and the Mayans in particular, with these new discoveries from a different DNA compartment, which we can get to. There's links to China back to 1000 BC. And one of the things I've been doing is comparing, and I can fool my colleagues, comparing Mesoamerican art to ancient Bronze Age Chinese art, and I can befuddle them. Well, they'll pick the wrong thing. Which, again, if there was a genetic link, you'd expect there to be a cultural link, perhaps. Again, this is 3,000 years ago. But there's really interesting things coming out of this. You can see hints of this in the academic literature where, again, according to evolution, this should not be true. I have one archaeological book on, I think, Mexico, where he says, yeah, there's Veracruz coast, Mexico culture, Veracruz culture that for no apparent reason shows similarities in terms of its art style to early Bronze Age China, which of course no apparent reason because there can't be any connections that happened 15,000 years ago. There's no validation, no links between the two ever since then. Lo and behold, there have been multiple migrations. Maybe I'll just get to it then. So in July, announced with female inherited DNA, 2 other migrations, a 100s BC migration and 1000s BC migration. So this has been a dynamic place for the entirety of its history before Europeans arrived. And there's other hints that are emerging, which I find fascinating. I did want to say this too, just because I want to add sort of an asterisk or a caveat to the idea of how much harmony is there between the genetics and the indigenous histories. Obviously, at the very beginning point, I've just talked about migrations from Asia into the Americas that would conflict with what the Lakota say about we've always been here. And one history I read, or I should say one testimony in a sense I read that I found really interesting. I've got a book, an academic book on Athabascan history. And of course, there's many Athabascan languages in Alaska, or Athabascan language family members, I should say AAC Athabascan language family members. Well, this is from a Mescalero Apache, so not up in Alaska, but down in New Mexico, Arizona area. And Bernard II was the elder's name. So this testimony then comes from an academic source to evolutionists who interviewed him over the period of, 20 years. Bernard II, they say, was a brilliant man, spoke 7 languages: Japanese, Navajo, Apache, English, and who knows what else. I don't remember, but a really sharp guy. Was, of course, keeping the accounts, their histories. The Mescalero girl's puberty ceremony talks about migrations from the land of the Great White North. And they said that Bernard, of course, maintained, as a matter of, I think, doctrine and tribal history, that the Apache, Mescalero Apache, had originated here on this continent, which, of course, strong echoes then of what the Lakota also say. And they said that he was aware of the evolutionary view, that there was this migration from Asia 15,000 years ago, and they said he recognized it as the product of academic study, but of course naturally disagreed with it. And what changed Bernard II's mind over a period of time was when a Japanese visitor came, I think, to the Mescalero Apache Reservation and talked. So I guess the two of them talked in Japanese for a while. And Bernard was struck not by, let's say, physical similarities in terms of hair color, skin tone, that sort of thing, or even that, I don't know if he even talked about any similarities between Japanese languages and Athabascan ones. It was the cultural similarities that really got the wheels turning in Bernard's mind, and I think it was the Japanese Bushido culture and the Apache way of the warrior, and anyway, there were details there that he found compelling, and the evolutionary authors said it became then a matter of, I guess, academic interest or a personal mission for Bernard to figure out how could he reconcile his tribe's own history of we originated here, yet there's these obvious cultural similarities to the Japanese culture. And they said he eventually came to the conclusion that yes, the Mescalero became a people here on this continent, but they have biological links or cultural links. There must be some link to Asia, which I found very fascinating. And I realized after being at the Lakota Treaty Council conference, I guess I had this, there are many things I've been very naive about and have had to learn the hard way. I think I thought again, naively, this is a confession, for many years that the idea that Native Americans say we originated here was, that's just politically convenient. So that's not a brag, that's a confession. And realized, no, this is a matter of religious doctrine, and so to give up or to give up that idea, or to acknowledge a crossing of the Bering Strait or some link to Asia is akin to conversion. That's how serious it is for a Native American or perhaps a Native Alaskan to say, wait a minute, maybe there are links elsewhere. So the caveat I wanted to add was, yes, there's confirmations of this young Earth creationist view of many migration accounts. At the beginning, I recognize there's going to be some conflicts. I also recognize it's a process of time for people to work through this. Thinking again of Bernard II, it took him some time to not necessarily be confronted with it, but to experience something outside of his normal cultural experience on the reservation, let's say, to encounter a Japanese person. And I guess from a Christian background, I've seen up close, in a sense, what conversion looks like. And even within a Christian worldview, sometimes there's conversion to other theological positions. So I think of being at a small Baptist junior college in Texas giving a talk on dinosaurs. It was just a worldview talk, basically, in 45 minutes. And I had a guy come up to me afterwards rather distraught saying, you could tell it bothered him a lot, and he was really struggling. He said, everything you've just said in 45 minutes contradicts everything I've heard in the public schools. And that's all he knew, even though he's in a Baptist junior college, probably grew up in a Christian home. And you could tell he probably wanted to agree with me, but he felt like he had to throw out everything he'd ever learned, do a brain transplant of sorts. And so my advice to him was, don't do that. Brain transplants are dramatic. My point was not to avoid conversion as much as take it slowly. Deal with these one issue at a time. You can try to just throw it all off and put on something new, but there's going to be these mental contradictions in your head that bother you, so work through them step by step. Don't try to take it all at once and just give up because you're 5 minutes in. Recognize that if you've gone through years and years of learning things one way, it's going to take time to learn something else, confront it, decide what you think about it, work through the evidence. And so that's my relationship right now, I would say, with the Lakota, which I recognize they're in the process in a sense of there's things about the outside world we're learning now for the first time. We're learning about DNA. We're learning about, well, how do we explain sub-Saharan African peoples within our worldview? How do we explain the Indian peoples or the Pakistani peoples if everyone, and asking questions like, well, could we rearrange the DNA tree where we put the start in America and everyone comes out of the America? Anyway, you can see the wheels turning. And I recognize it's a process of time to deal with the new data and to try to make sense of it. And my conversations with them have not been learn this or else as much as let's keep the dialogue open. And I feel like it's been very productive.
Yeah, my mind is kind of spinning with everything you just said, especially about, the female mitochondrial DNA is revealing things about the Mayans and their history. And then what you're talking about, for someone to reorient their minds around a different history than they have been accommodated to is akin to a conversion. And I know in my wife and I's own struggle we've had a history of depression and anxiety. In our counseling, we've learned that to get out of cyclical anxious thoughts, you have to reorient your mind. You have to exercise your mind. And it reminds me of, Romans 12:1, don't be conformed to the world, but renew your mind. So always asking questions as followers of Jesus, as believers, as biblical Christians, we ought to be curious. We ought to not be afraid of hard questions. We ought to be willing to go down these thought paths and change our minds. And of course, we stay rooted in Scripture, but we ought to be, if we have truth on our side, we should not be afraid of any question. And it's actually exciting how the tables are turning now with just the offensive nature of creation science, and it's not overturning Native history, it's confirming it and their identity and their history. It's actually confirming of who they say they are in most cases. So it's really, really fascinating stuff. And could you, Dr. Jeanson, summarize for us? So here in Alaska, we have the Eskimo Aleut people, and we have Athabascans, as you said. There's Inuits, or in the past they were known as the Thules. Could you summarize? So who are they? Could you summarize who they are for us?
Yes, and maybe I'll give the sort of a timeline briefly of the Americas as a whole, because it's dynamic, and then how it plays out specifically in Alaska, and to give even a global context to this. So what I'm going to get at is Native Alaskans in the language families you mentioned are mixes just like every other people group on Earth. So I learned world history, which is basically history of Western civilization in school, and there's tons of migrations in the Middle East. There's migrations into Europe. We just already alluded to some of them, mentioned them, that you have the indigenous Europeans, but then you have Huns coming in, and then, of course, there's many other migrations that happen. So everywhere we look around the globe, everyone is a mix of different lineages. No surprise, because that's been human history. It's been very dynamic. And in a sense, what I've found, I guess, refreshing about these discoveries is I feel like it restores humanity in a sense to a degree to Native Americans, and I want to explain that. In the evolutionary worldview, I feel like one of the perhaps subconscious consequences of the idea that there was one migration 15,000 years ago, and then Native Americans have sat here in isolation, no contact with anyone else for 15,000 years or 14,500 years, is unlike anywhere else on the globe. Everywhere else on Earth, there's interactions, migrations, movements of peoples, and somehow Native Americans are other, not like the rest of humanity. It's this othering, and it could almost get demeaning. I feel like that's a
Can I
concern that comes
comment
to me.
on that? Because that what you just said has fascinated me for a long time. Even since I was a little kid in public high school, learning about the 15,000 years ago, it's almost like nothing happened for 14,000 years or whatever. Like they left behind a few arrowheads, which we use dating methods, and that's about it. And I feel like if tens of thousands of people lived here for that long, there's not enough remains. I feel like we should be finding so much more than we are. And, that's just a layman, casually looking at this. But that's always been a head scratcher for me in that history. And that's why it's always been in the back of my head. It just seems like there's something not right about that narrative. And like you're saying, that they lived that long here with basically no impact, no migration, leaving no remains almost. And that has always kind of been a head scratcher for me. So
yes, civilization went down here is one of my main takeaways then from the young Earth view. Went down here just like everywhere else on the globe, meaning Native Americans are just like everyone else on the globe. They're not some subhuman or somehow other. They're part of the global human family. And I think that's an important and a satisfying takeaway. In terms of what specifically went down then from the data, the genetic data, both the female inherited mitochondrial DNA and the male inherited Y chromosome DNA, the oldest lineage I can find in the Americas is the 1000 BC. Of course, in Mexico, the Olmec civilization predates that, so there must have been another migration before that, whose lineage I've not yet detected. So 5 migrations at least in total, something that comes to the Americas early on, gives rise to the Olmecs, perhaps others, Clovis culture, and so forth. Then I've got a mitochondrial lineage, female inherited DNA, for 1000 BC. This, I think, strongly corresponds to the rise of the Mayan civilization. And again, the Americas are not just a dynamic place connecting this hemisphere to Asia, but even within North and South America, there's migrations up and down. So I mentioned the Mayans because that's one of the best studied archaeological cultures with the most remains, but it's not just the Mayans likely that migration gave rise to. There's peoples up and down the Americas, North, Central, and South America. But that's the best echo I can see archaeologically and historically. In 100 BC, there's another migration. And let me back up and say that the 100 BC mitochondrial migration corresponds to a time of other migrations from Asia. And I know this from the Y chromosome. I just don't have the Native American side of it yet. And the Y chromosome 1000 BC shows migrations from the Siberian, Mongolian era down into Japan, through the Philippines to Papua New Guinea. A branch goes off into India. There's a time that ultimately then gives rise to the Polynesians. So 1000 BC is not a surprise, is what I'm getting at, because there's other migrations we know from genetics happening at that time. 100 BC is interesting. Again, the origin is sort of that northeastern Asian region, and this is a period in history when the Han Dynasty, of course, you think of China, you think of the Great Wall. The Great Wall was a military construction to keep the invaders out, and primarily the invaders from the north. And one of the most famous invaders from the north are people called the Xiongnu, which, I learned very little Chinese history growing up, but if you study Chinese history, very well known. They ruled parts of China for a time, and the last century before Christ is when the Han Chinese finally pushed them back out. And so it wouldn't surprise me if one of the reactions to this defeat is, let's get out of here. And they came into the Americas. 100s BC is when the great city of Teotihuacan in Mexico begins to rise in terms of its sudden population rise. So I think the Xiongnu came over and then gave rise to this great city of Teotihuacan. Eventually had 200,000 people. And this is before even 600 years elapsed in Central America after Christ. So massive city at that early point in history. It eventually, of course, gets violently overthrown by that point, and I think it's violently overthrown because you have this invaders, these relatives of the Huns, which I now know by Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, about the 400s-ish AD they come over, and then the last migration being the 900s, the Algic people groups. And so today, you can look at Athabaskan peoples, you can look at Eskimo-Aleut peoples in terms of their DNA. All across the Americas in terms of Y chromosomes, the deepest lineages are this 400s migration. It seems that whoever came over, they wiped out the males who were here before, but not the females. Though there may still be echoes of those earlier migrations in the Y chromosome, just at low levels. So we have a fairly, based on statistics, fairly good guess as to which sub-branch of this Q, haplogroup Q, the 400s AD migration, Eskimo-Aleut peoples belong to. A fairly good guess as to which branch is Athabaskan, or at least Athabascans who ended up in the southwest of the United States. So there's progress made on that front. Again, that fits the general pattern of up and down the Americas. This is the major branch. You will also find remnants of that haplogroup C, which is that Algic or Algonquian 900s AD migration, because the Algics marched through Alaska. Their own records, the Red Record talks about that, and fighting peoples who are already there. So you see in the terms of the Y chromosome echoes up there. What was really interesting to me and surprising is the dominant mitochondrial lineage up in the Arctic regions is the 100s BC migration. So just to summarize then, the Y chromosome arrival in the 400s not only seemed to wipe out whoever was here before, but precipitated a massive hemisphere-wide migration, a great scattering of peoples. So much so that the vast majority then, based on published studies of Native Alaskans, belong to that Teotihuacan lineage and ultimately trace back to the peoples down there. And I would say tracing back then, if you go further to the west, which we call now the Far East, into China, likely to the Xiongnu and perhaps other peoples from Central Asia. So that's the data we have available right now. There's much more to uncover, both from indigenous histories as far as I'm concerned, but drilling down into the details of genetics, we should be able to find even more history, be able to recover more migrations. For example, archaeology talks about a migration from Alaska towards Greenland. And I'm guessing you're going to find a genetic echo of that. It's really interesting that the timing seems to correspond to approximately the time when the Algic migration happened in the 8900s or so. So it makes you wonder about cause and effect. But that's the summary then for the Native Alaskans. The Y chromosome is dominantly this group Q, but also some group C. So there's that 400s and 900s migration echo, as you might expect, given where the migrations typically come from. But in terms of mitochondrial, I was surprised by that far north and that concentrated an echo of the Teotihuacan civilization way down in Mesoamerica.
Well, that's actually news to me about the Teotihuacan connection to Native Alaskans. So, yeah, that's fascinating. So it could be that their origins go back to about 100 BC, but also a migration in the 400s-ish. And then a lot of things changed with the 900s migration of the Algics. So, yeah, fascinating history. And it does kind of overturn the normal narrative we learn in our schools. Now, before we kind of wrap up and I want to plug like how to connect with you and help with your research. Before we do that, I do want to ask you about some other videos you've put out recently about the 99% versus the 1%. So it's answering the question, why do the vast majority of scientists advocate for and believe in evolution, and such a small minority believe in young Earth creation? I mean, are young Earth creationists just lunatics, or are they just flat earthers? Are they just, what could be the reason for that? And you've kind of researched that recently. Could you talk about that a few minutes?
And that's probably the most common question we would get in response to everything I've just said. Hey, it all sounds persuasive, sounds great, but why do so many smart people disagree with you? What's the explanation? Journalists who are secularists like to use it as a gotcha question because they think there's only two answers, both of which make us look like fools. One of them being that I don't believe in science, or that creationists don't actually believe in science, and so who cares what the smart people actually hold to? In a sense, I guess they're hoping I'll say something like, God did it, I believe it, that settles it, which is true. And I think back of Christians in the 1950s or earlier, before the modern young Earth creationist revival, before there was a widespread young Earth creationist movement nationally, where we didn't have the answers scientifically that we have now. And I greatly respect those who said, you know what, I don't have the answers, but I believe the Bible, and I know God's going to reconcile it someday in my mind, or maybe when I get to heaven, and I accept it by faith because it's God's word. And those people, to me, had even more faith than I do, and had a strong stance. Today, of course, the journalist wants me to say, well, it doesn't matter what science says. I don't believe in science, which it looks stupid. They're going to sit there with some sort of technology device recording what I'm saying, which is built on science, of course. And so if I give that answer, it just looks dumb. The second bad option would be that I think there's some sort of vast conspiracy to suppress the truth. They, of course, don't believe Romans chapter 1 and could care less about the teaching God gives us through Paul about the natural man suppressing the truth about God and nature in unrighteousness. They just know this sort of conspiracy talk sounds foolish. So they're hoping I'm saying that. I found an answer last year. We had a Brazilian academic group come up, Evangelical University, for training, and I was trying to make the case what a great difference Christian education makes. So I was running some numbers on enrollment, and we've got a list of like-minded schools here at Answers in Genesis. There's, of course, you can look up other schools where students might hear something other than evolution. For example, I think Loma Linda is Seventh-day Adventist, and so they will teach, I think their view is like a young earth, old universe, or Liberty's kind of waffle on the age of the earth question or creation question. I'm trying to think of other schools, but maybe Hillsdale will teach something like intelligent design. So they might fully endorse the mainstream timescale, but question evolution. Anyway, there's not a lot of schools that teach something other than evolution. It's a very finite list. You can look up enrollment numbers, and it turns out that the percentage of students who hear only evolution in their entire undergraduate education is 99%. It's an exact match. And in statistical terms, the enrollment figures perfectly predict the outcome figures. Or you can make the mathematical case that PhDs are evolutionists because that's all they're ever taught. And I can make it supported a second way. The court cases from the 1980s that kicked creation science out of the public schools. Why do they do that? If evolutionists are, if PhDs are simply these smart people who learn to evaluate claims and weigh opposing data and think their way into evolution, not just because they're taught that way, who cares what else students are taught? My point is the evolutionist behavior in which they've fought tooth and nail to kick creation science out shows that they believe more than I do, that students end up how they're taught. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. 99% of PhDs are evolutionists because that's how the courts have decreed it, how evolutionists have manufactured it. It's all a product of their own efforts, and not because there's some difference between intelligence or available evidence or that sort of thing. It's all because they've determined it to be that way. So it's not a legit argument against the validity of these claims. You can think of other arguments, perhaps, to try to counteract what I'm saying, but the idea that so many people disagree, well, that's just because that's all they're allowed to learn. And my personal experience is with people who've, not been exposed to creation science. Well, I should say, for many people, when I talk about my views, even theistic evolutionists, and I'll give one example, personal example here. So Daryl Falk is or was in a leadership position at BioLogos. They hold to and strongly exhort the church to accept evolution as true and try to harmonize it with Scripture. He and I did a debate at the Evangelical Theological Society, and one condition of doing the debate was that he would meet with me ahead of time. We could develop a friendship in Christ, was his term, I think. So we met for 4 hours, very friendly, very cordial, until the very end when he said, let's just put all the cards on the table. Here's what I'm going to say, and then I told him what I was going to say. So Daryl laid out his views. I almost could finish his sentence for him because I study what my opponents say. That's just debating 101. Know what your opponent says more than he does. And when I started articulating my view and saying that I was going to show science in support of it, conversation completely changed. It got shut down real fast. He was almost offended. And I was thinking, you didn't know that we use science to support what we're saying? And I found out they've put in print that they basically believe that disagreeing with mainstream science is akin to lying. So they don't even bother to find out what I say. And it's that sort of visceral reaction is par for the course in my experience. People are not exposed to other views, and when you start to present a young Earth view, especially based on science, they have a visceral reaction because it shatters the world they've taken for granted. They didn't even know this existed. And before they can even start engaging the claims, it's just, whoa, wait a minute. How can someone question this and base it on science? They're completely unprepared to deal with it, which underscores how stifling a monopoly the evolutionists have on public education, so that people can come out of it and say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't even know this other world existed. And that's what's going on.
I think this reflects, too, I guess, just my own experience growing up in public school. There was no, for me, in my experience, there's no animosity towards other views. It was simply presented as this is simply the case. Phrases like the evidence is overwhelming. And I've shared this in other podcast episodes, but in my experience in my high school science classes, for example, I was shown charts and words like proof and strong evidence, and scientists overwhelmingly agree, all of these phrases regarding evolution. And then I go to Sunday school and I'm showed a cartoon picture of Noah's Ark and I'm told that's true. And so when that is your experience as a young person, it does form in your mind the ridiculousness, seemingly, of the biblical narrative, and because it's presented that way. And it's just so embedded in our education system, and even on online forums. If you're in any discussion on this issue, it's probably 90% from the secular side is you're akin to flat earthers, it's ridiculous, science confirms. There's a lot of rhetoric, but very little content. Useful content. And so when you speak of a particular view with such dismissiveness, it's hard to want to take time to consider it. And so that's kind of been my experience, at least. So, good. Thank you, Nathaniel. This has been just illuminating. I actually learned a few new things I didn't know from you. And I told you at the beginning that my goal is to highlight your research so that Alaskans can pay some attention to it. And one thing you're looking for to move forward in your research is help for people to reach out to you. I know you're looking for more genetic data from Native people. Could you explain that a little bit? And you can put in the plug, and I will also put it in the show notes. Could you explain what it is you're hoping from people like me, like regular Alaskans, what you're looking for?
There's three things come to mind. And to go back to the court decision, let's say a skeptic says, fine, there's a manufactured consensus, but still the courts kicked creation science out for a reason. It's because you all don't do science. And I want to emphasize back to where we started, this is offensive. You can talk about the court's decisions and stipulations in a number of different ways. Technically, I think the quote would be that for creationists to do science, we have to do things that are testable and falsifiable, which we can get into a long, nerdy discussion about the philosophy of science. A good analogy would be, if you look at how creationists have often done this debate, it's often been in the form of lawyer work where we cross-examine evolutionary claims. I think that's been done very successfully. The court said that's not enough. You must also do detective work. Go find a question, gather your own evidence, go solve it. That's exactly what this research has been doing, objectively so. We've now met the court standard for doing science. If we wanted to relitigate this, we could. Regardless, and even putting aside the apologetic part, I do wish to see this taught in schools. I grew up knowing nothing about pre-European Americas, and even if we were to leave the apologetic side out, one of the purposes of this research and of publishing the book is I don't want people to grow up like I did. I think that the wider American public, and especially even on let's say reservations or reserves, this is the history. Learning history, even though many people find history classes boring and all these dates and facts, when you learn it, it builds respect. How can you respect something you don't know? So simply having it taught as part of the curriculum builds, I think, respect for those who came before and those who are still here. So I have a great interest, number one, in seeing this eventually getting into the schools. I'm not a educator or a lawyer by training, a scientist, of course, so it's a bit outside my discipline, but that's one way to help if anyone's interested in helping with how do we get this taught and have the next generation come up and not grow up like I did, knowing nothing about it. Secondly, the indigenous histories have been enormous in figuring out how all this history went down. I wrote the book based on what I could find, but I know there's more history out there, would love to get in touch with anyone who knows more of the indigenous histories. In the book, They Had Names. I don't discuss a ton of, or hardly any, Alaskan indigenous history, just because from the published literature I could not find much. But my guess is it's out there and would love to know it. So if anyone can help in that respect, would love to know. That's the second arena. Third, of course, is with genetics. That's, of course, a sensitive topic. And right now, all I'm doing is making contacts with people who might be interested. Contacting me doesn't commit anyone to anything. All of it would be done ethically in accordance with law. So just to give an example of some of the questions that came up at the Lakota Treaty Council conference, I already knew that the question of privacy was a huge issue. I've got a verbal agreement with the retired head of Family Tree DNA who had said, so long as I could have an institutional ethics review board supervising what I was doing and I was getting informed consent and all that, basically legally protecting Family Tree DNA, he could send me test kits and I would have the personal information for people who are participating, because you have to get informed consent, but the company would not. So we've got a way to put a break between the company that owns the data and the personal information of the participants. The second question, though, that came up that I hadn't anticipated, though, but it's a valid one from the Lakota conference was, will the sample be destroyed? Concerns about, are they going to use this DNA that I give to clone me or do something harmful to Native Americans? And those are valid concerns. It may sound like science fiction. It's not. There were crazy things that were happening 15 years ago when I left graduate school. I was working in stem cells. And at that time, they were already mixing human stem cells and mouse stem cells to make a mouse with a humanized blood system, a mouse with a humanized brain. I mean, really bizarre stuff. And that's the stuff that was known in academic circles, and you don't have any idea what's happening behind closed doors in commercial circles. So this is perfectly legitimate to say, what are they going to do with this sample? And so I'd say I don't have that solved. I mean, I could go to Family Tree DNA and say, could you destroy the sample? And I wouldn't be surprised if they say sure. I just don't trust them. So with the privacy issue, I have control then over what they get and what they don't. With the destruction of the sample, all I have is their word, which I don't believe. That's no disrespect to them. It's just, I think, a good working model. And so I would need to have my own lab, and I have some Christian academic connections. One's an entrepreneur at a Christian university, and we've talked about, can we set up a lab, which then I can personally assure the destruction of the sample, but that's one thing I haven't been able to solve. But there is an interest, I have an interest in, and I think we could recover more history from additional DNA samples. Any Native Alaskans who want to participate or at least explore that possibility would be to contact me as well. And so the way to do that, and this is how, or a version of this is how the executive director for the Lakota Treaty Council Conference contacted me. We have a website. So the homepage from our organization is answersingenesis.org. And then to find the portal to connect with me, it's answersingenesis.org/go/they-had-names, which is the title of the book. answersingenesis.org/go/they-had-names. And if you scroll down, so there's a big map there you can download for free of the pre-European situation in North America map that I didn't have growing up, but I hang it on my wall now just because it's a way to visualize who was here, what happened to a degree. If you scroll down, there's a way to enter your name, email, message, goes directly to my inbox. So that's how I've got in touch with lots of different people. I had another version of that for the earlier book, Trace the Human DNA's Big Surprise. But that portal will allow us to get in touch. We can talk over the phone, whatever it is. It's just a way to get in touch with me. If you're a missionary, hey, I want to know more about this, or maybe there's, and I know this because I just got in touch with a lady from one of the Siouan tribes, and she was saying a number of them had already taken DNA tests. That's another option too. Like, hey, I've taken a DNA test. What does it mean? Can you help me figure out my history? Can you help me find relatives? That's all been very satisfying, especially for people who've been adopted or that sort of thing. Not, all that's free, of course, too. There's no charge for any of this. It's an ongoing research project. So those are the arenas I would love to have help for anyone who'd like to. I know this is also relationship-based. I say that because I grew up, my mother's German. I grew up half German culture, which I think I've absorbed, perhaps subconsciously or consciously, is very transactional. Shake hands and we're done. None of this getting to know people. Having traveled extensively in Latin America, I know that's a very different culture, and it's all relationship-based. And I think to a degree, Native American culture is that way, and I'm not trying to equate them as much as that's what I've told myself, to be less German when I'm in Native American contexts and to be more relational. And so happy to do that. I'll probably be out in Oklahoma because I've got a Choctaw pastor contact. They've got a conference or it's kind of like a Bible school that's going on. I'm like, this is a way for us to get to know one another. Trust is a key issue. And I was in August up at the Center for Indian Ministries in Minnesota, working amongst the Ojibwe, among other tribes. But hey, it's face to face. And now, who are you? What do you want? And can I trust you? All that's valuable. So happy to take those steps too. But those are the arenas, I think, in which we can advance the ball even more and recover even more history of what transpired here.
Yeah, and I appreciate your cultural sensitivity. I've experienced that here in Alaska as well. You do have to be invited. They have good reason to be, cautious in who they invite into their circles. And so for guys like you and I, as a part German myself, who wants to do things in German ways, the cultural sensitivity and respect is wildly important, and you do that really well. So, make sure you check out answersingenesis.org/go/they had names. I'll put a link in the show notes. And you can also check out the Answers in Genesis YouTube, and Dr. Jeanson has his own YouTube channel, and he posts his content on there. If you're not as much of a reader, you can watch it. So make sure for you listeners, you Alaskans, or people who, some of my listeners want to be Alaskans, and they're in the lower 48, make sure you check out Jeanson's work. Reach out to him if you have any connections to any of the things he just said. Make sure you reach out. So, Nathaniel Jeanson, thank you again. Thank you for hosting my family and I when we visited the Ark. It was so sweet to spend time with you, and I appreciate your friendship. And maybe we'll have you up here in Alaska before we know it.
It was great to get to know you all then, and keep up our relationship this way too. So thanks for having me on.
You bet.